Hey Ben, so I'm definitely a left-leaning student, but I listen to your podcast every day.
Well, thank you for coming and thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So my question is about race and culture. So while I agree with you that when you look at white America, it's silly to say that the majority of white Americans are actively trying to prevent you from getting to where you want to be. I'm East Indian, and I have definitely experienced some racism, but I never felt as though it keeps Indians from succeeding. So I do think there's a cultural component that supersedes the color of your skin. But I also think that it's naive to say that it just so happens that the same minority groups that have been historically oppressed happen to have cultures that are less conducive to success. I believe that environment can create culture. Can you acknowledge the historical reasonings that led that these so-called unsuccessful cultures and not put blame on these minority groups? I know that in your heart, I don't think you're a racist person, but in my opinion, to blame people for their failure, for their cultural failures, without taking into consideration historical, the history in general, conceals a lack of empathy and sort of hints at racism.
Okay, so I'll fight back on the last point that there's anything to do with empathy or racism here, but I fully agree with you. Like 100, not like 90%, like 100%. I think that bad cultures are generally the result of bad things that have happened in the past or bad modes of thought that have prevailed over time. So, for example, there's a great book by Thomas Sowell called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and that book essentially suggests that a lot of the pathologies that exist about single motherhood, for example, in the black community, or high rates of violence, are actually outgrowths of a slave and post-slave culture that was imposed by a white society that didn't bother with policing, that didn't care about inculcating morals or virtues in slaves. Obviously, they actually actively fought against it because they didn't want that to happen. And so there was an active fight from against assimilation by white people, and that created an underground culture that's really bad, and that exists in parts of white America, too. It exists in Appalachia. So yes, I think bad cultures have nothing to do with race. I don't think that just because, this is why I'm saying I don't know why it borders on racism to say the cultures are bad. Like, some cultures are bad, some cultures are good, and that has nothing to do with race. Charles Murray wrote an entire book called Coming Apart about pathologies in white communities that are really destructive. So bad cultures do arise very often from historical circumstances, including historical discrimination. What I say is that today, there's nothing preventing an individual from superseding the culture in which you grew up and making good decisions. In a free country, somebody's going to have to break this chain. Somebody's going to have to break this cycle. And so, am I going to? I don't care if you want to say that the pathologies that exist in the black community, black inner city community of high rates of single motherhood and violence, for example, or lack of institutional wealth, that is a result of historic racism. I'm fine with you saying that. I don't have any problem with that. I'm not talking about historical racism when I talk about white privilege. I'm talking about right now the idea that there's a superstructure of rules and laws that are preventing you from succeeding, or a culture that is trying to keep you down. I don't think that's the case. So the question becomes, if you are here, let's say that on average, the culture in white America, or with regard to single motherhood, to take an example, is here, right? Because there's less single motherhood in the white community than the black community. And in the black community, it's here because it's 70% single motherhood rate, and the white community is 40%. Okay, so the question is, before, thanks to racism and thanks to discrimination, there was a cap on the black community that was here, and they couldn't get past it. Okay, now the ceiling's been removed. So what do you as an individual black person do to change your life? And I don't think it's helpful, and in fact I think it's actually quite hurtful, to spend an enormous amount of time talking about the legacy of discrimination and racism instead of talking about what can you do right now to fix your problem. You know, this is a general issue that I have in all of my relationships. When my wife comes to me and she says, there's a problem in my life, before we even have the conversation, I say to her, is this a listening conversation, or is this a you want me to fix it conversation? And I think that when it comes to politics, there should be far fewer listening conversations, like I want you to tell me about all the crap that's happened to you, because I don't care. I mean, I care, but it doesn't. But now the question is, what you going to do? Right? That's a much more important conversation, because we only have 5 minutes together. Is that 5 minutes going to be spent on all the terrible things that happened, which I fully agree with, that I would have fought if I were there, but I wasn't? Right? Are we going to spend 5 minutes talking about all the terrible things that happened to blacks and Jews and gays and women and Hispanics in the United States? Or are we going to talk about right now what you can do to succeed? Because I don't think that the rules are holding you back. So I've never, ever, at any point suggested that there's not been historic discrimination against black people, or even that current-day poverty is at least in part an outgrowth of that historic discrimination. What I have suggested is that if you are using that historic discrimination as a reason why you are not, as an individual human being, becoming more income mobile and not making good decisions, no one is making the call for you right now as an individual to get that girl pregnant. And that's the argument that I'm making.
Can I say one thing?
Sure, yeah.
So I guess, like, would you like, so don't, you have to admit though that between different races and different cultures there are different levels of success, and there's definitely, you would expect that somebody who grows up with being able less to succeed, you would expect that would happen in certain communities and certain
Right, that's why they're called
communities.
pathologies of culture. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you grew up in a worse situation than somebody else who grew up in a better situation, of course you're going to grow up having obstacles that other person has to overcome. But that doesn't mean that other person, number one, victimized you. Right? There's no one in America today, for example, who's enslaved a black person that I know of, or if they have, they'd be in jail. I'm sure that nobody in this room, right, none of the young white people in this room were alive during the times of Jim Crow. So the question is, do we take away from the white people in this room to rectify historic injustices, or do we recognize that history is filled with historic injustices, and now we're going to have to find a way to overcome those obstacles together without redistributing income, for example? Now, I have called for movements, for example, for companies to go into inner cities and make a deal with students in inner cities and say to them, listen, you get good grades and we'll pay for your college, and then you come afterward and you work for us for 3 years to pay off that debt. And I think there are things that we can do in the private sector. This is why I think religious communities are so important. I'm not against charity. I'm not against us as individuals going out and helping people. What I am against is the idea that the government can fix this problem, because the government cannot fix historic inequity. All the government can do is set the rules at an equal level, equal law, equal judgment under law, equal justice under law is the only way that we're ever going to approach anything that looks like a fair society. There's no such thing as a fair society where the government plays God and gives some to others and takes from others.
So, like, would you say that we should, like, other people who are not, in an oppressed state, they should wait for other people to pull themselves up? Do you think that's how we should solve it, or do you think there is a moral
I think every culture in
responsibility?
American history, every individual in American history who has succeeded has had a combination of people who help them out, not in the government, people who help them out, and their own capacity to bootstrap it. And when my great-grandparents got here, they were dirt poor and didn't speak English. Great-great-grandparents got here. They were dirt poor and didn't speak English. This is true for virtually everybody in the room, right? At some point, somebody came over here and they were dirt poor and didn't speak English. And that doesn't mean that on a generational level, people are going to go from 0 to 100. But it does mean that we're going to need to move in the right direction as opposed to sitting around and talking about historic injustice all day, because that doesn't get anything done. Thanks so much.